Hello, I'm Susie. Welcome to my podcast. I think a lot about the idea of rights. Conflicts centering on the concept of rights exist throughout human history in one form or another. Rights of sovereignty, rights of succession, rights of suffrage. Where do they come from? What does it mean to have a right? I have a lot of thoughts about it. I'd like to share them with you. As my ideas for this podcast have evolved, I've had a lot of great help from people who I trust. And I'm going to follow some really good advice for this topic. I'm going to break it up into three parts. The first part will be dealing with sort of the idea of rights in general, and in specific, the idea of rights in America. That's where I live, so that's what I think about most. In the second part, I'll be talking about concepts of power and ideas of winning. And then in the third part, I'll be talking about principles of fear and throughout kind of finding the connective tissues between how the ideas of rights have evolved throughout human history. I hope you'll hang out with me and listen to those thoughts. Human rights in America has really been foundational to our whole existence. The idea of rights, and particularly the idea of universal rights, is, as Americans, rooted in our understanding of our Declaration of Independence, which was the document that first began our separation from the English monarchy, as most good Americans know. The interesting thing about the Declaration of Independence, there are so many, but famously authored by Thomas Jefferson, who was himself, an Enlightenment thinker and was heavily influenced by other Enlightenment thinkers of the time, such as John Locke and Jeremy Bentham. I'll talk a little bit more about them in a moment. But at its most basic, in contemporary society, we tend to think about rights in the context of civil rights or legal rights, the conflicts of individual citizens and their battles for equity in their moral and legal rights in the country. But at its origin, the idea of rights was something very different. And in part, I think, because the idea of humanity as a whole was different and more, less with respect to the individual organism and more with respect to humanity as a social structure. All things, I think, are dependent upon our understanding of our social structure and why they're subject to so much disagreement, because where you are in the social structure can really influence your ideas about that social structure. For example, at the beginning of the American Revolution, the idea of one's role in the social structure within the British colonies on the American continent were that they were subjects of the king, and subjects to perhaps whimsical, perhaps tyrannical rule, to which they had no recourse or no power. And that was seriously problematic for revolutionary Americans. But I think it's important to note that those rights that they set forth in that moment originated in the rights of commerce and economic independence, which ultimately filters out to more basic needs stuff, obviously. But, it also has a framework of power. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth. But if you're a white male landowner, you have rights. But, the white male landowners were not the only individual humans comprising the population of the then colonies. A lot of those people were convicts, for example, transported from Britain because it was easier to basically conscript servitude labor as penance, right? Rather than house and feed and shelter convicted criminals. They forfeited their rights for all intents and purposes. Further, slavery was, a common practice, not just in the United States, but throughout the known Western world, Europe and Russia, even Africa as far back as Egypt, Romans after them, that slaves were very much part of social structure throughout our history, imported in a brand new way in the U.S. and made very much our own. But again, in essence, the British colonies, of course, inherited European class structure. European class structure obviously informs how your role is defined amongst others. Where are you on the level, in the rankings, if you were, you can think about it in some ways as like Indian caste systems. But interestingly, the Enlightenment sort of sets aside those questions for the moment. But importantly, these are big questions, right? And at the time, you are looking at a revolutionary set of ideals being set forth here, where everything before, in terms of your rights as an individual, was in essence defined again by your place in the social structure. And the Enlightenment, kind of removes that thinking in the sense that it's not dependent upon, a power structure sort of endowing you with rights. It's something wholly apart and independent from those other social structures. The Enlightenment period, beginning around the late 17th century, mid to late 17th century, a period representing a massive transition in thinking, also sometimes referred to as the Age of Reason. In matters of state, the value of a person isn't defined by their place in the social order in this thinking. In theory. And the state itself is not seen as ordained by heaven. You see this obviously a maneuver towards the separation of church and state, for example. The U.S. Constitution, another sort of obviously foundational document, like by definition a foundational document in the United States. The Constitution was heavily influenced by Enlightenment thinkers such as John Locke. And for Locke, sovereignty, the idea of sovereign rights, resides in the people. Government is basically the natural rights of the people and the social contract in relationship, and also the separation of church and state features centrally in that relationship. So it's no longer the idea of king or emperor or czar or a power ordained by God. It's the power of the people to have control and agency over their own manifest destiny. So wholly new way of thinking. This is one of the reasons why America sort of stands apart in its ideology. In its ideology, America does continue to stand apart as a model of democracy. It's imperfect and it's deeply flawed for a lot of the reasons that I discussed throughout the course of this podcast. But yeah, I think it's really important to hold in our hearts as Americans the truth of the aspirational ideals. And I do think, that, and I've quoted before, Martin Luther King, who has said that the long arc of history bends towards justice. And I think the long arc of history bends towards balance and it bends towards truth. Truth will out, to coin another, cliched expression, but truth does have a way of making itself plain. And in particular, because if truth is masked by oppression, there's limits to how much people are willing to, hold on to and take it. There's limits to that. People have a point where they're like, no mas. And that comes on all sides, right? It comes from the sides of those being oppressed. And in some cases, it comes on sides of the oppressors whose mechanisms have to become more and more, frightening and elaborate to get their goals ultimately achieved. So again, the formation of the United States is founded upon this aspirational quality. Like, thank goodness. If it had been 100 years before, it might have been something very, very different. But in this moment in time, what you have is a whole bunch of people who believe in the transcendent quality of human reason. And they also believe that they are sort of gifted the ability to manifest these truths on behalf of their society, and that has obviously some really positive repercussions, and it has some really really negative repercussions, some of which we're still grappling with. And notably, slavery stands out as a really big problem from since before the formation of the United States. But in the formation of the United States, there was conversation about slavery, about how do we deal with that, and because it was a quotient more of economics than about humanity or rights of any kind, because again, these are not people. This is property. And when you're talking about property, the idea of rights is something that white men feel really passionate about. It's almost like it's in their DNA. No offense, white men. Like, I'm not blaming you. You come by your positions honestly. You've been told through your entire life, like you have this, entitlement to property and that it is sovereign, like ordained by God. So the fact that there's a lot of questions about the nature of that arrangement is, I'm sure, pretty scary. I don't blame you for reacting if you're one of those people who are reacting. Not all of you are. Shout out to my woke bays. I digress. Again, let's talk more though about those central ideas. Let's talk a little bit about what were those aspirational qualities that still exist in the frameworks of our documents. They're there, they're accessible, they're attainable if we make an effort, and if we continue to have conversations. So, yeah, I want to talk a little bit about the idea of universal rights. Another of the Enlightenment thinkers who had a significant influence over, in particular, the Constitution, Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham is commonly thought of as the father of utilitarianism. And even if you don't, even if you're not a philosopher and a person who studies philosophy, that you've heard of the concept of utilitarianism. It's very practically accessible on a number of levels. And again, it's a central component of our thinking within the Constitution, but in particular, in the formation and in the enforcement of law. So Jeremy, our good friend Jer Bear, he believes that utilitarianism is the best and most objective, sort of fair metric that you can use in the governance of societies. Examples of utilitarianism include taxes. Congratulations to you. You can thank Jeremy Bentham for the idea of taxes within a democratic institution, wherein those taxes are, kind of meant to be in a more an equal distribution of wealth in the sense of like support of the state, right, infrastructure and the people. Licenses, another thing. You're asked to sort of sacrifice a personal right by conforming to a set of government standards, to do certain things like drive a car, build a house, I don't know, fish. I think you still need a license to fish. I don't know. I don't fish. More sort of dramatic examples. Eminent domain is another one that sort of falls within the framework of utilitarianism, to the extent that the state deems a piece of personally held property as something essential to the management of the state, and they then can confiscate that land under the pretext of eminent domain, which is a difficult thing to achieve legally. So it's a high bar. Wartime acts, confiscation of property for the use of like hospitals or barracks or storage or whatever it may be. That's something that's been done and is allowed for within sort of the constraints of a utilitarianist framework. So again, though, there's a lot of sort of basic assumptions within that utilitarianism. It's nuanced. It has other mitigating factors, and that again sort of leads me into the idea of more universal rights. So the idea of universal rights, the thinking that there are rights on board, right, standard in the package, right? In the Declaration of Independence, those rights are understood to be not exclusive to, mind you, but consisting largely of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Inalienable is the word that's used in the Declaration of Independence. It's inalienable. And that is for Jefferson, a sort of self-defining concept. And it's easy to see why, in a way, from a person whose social structures depended a lot on religion. Try as you may to church and state separate the existence of God in your life is not something you can easily separate from your human manifestation. So, even if you can do so within a framework of law, it's difficult to be able to do so in the content of your soul. And everything that you do in the world is an expression of the content of your soul. So I think that's important to keep in mind. Human beings are deeply flawed individuals. Thomas Jefferson was no exception to that, a deeply flawed person. But inalienable rights is a difficult concept to get your head around if you really sit with it for a while, because, for one thing, in the practical execution of the idea of inalienable rights, they're still mitigated, right? Because of that social contract piece. It's you have these rights, but you might waive a right in a way through your action. It's mitigated by free will. For example, the 13th Amendment in the Constitution sort of defines rights for former slaves, but unless they're convicted of a crime, which begs the question of the nature of that conviction, doesn't it? Well, it does for me, right? Like, you're no longer a slave unless you get arrested for a crime and are in prison, in which case you sort of forfeit those rights. And the state is able to, kind of say that as part of your penance, not unlike the British, in their transportation of convicts to the American colonies, you are, in some ways, state labor. It's slavery, by another name. And that's tricky, because then it always comes back to, oh, you wouldn't be there if you hadn't convicted a crime. Okay, well, what was the crime? What was the crime? Because, you know, and this doesn't fall within the purviews of the legal structure, but I think it's a good, if extreme, example of how, reactions and sort of cultural assumptions about a certain act can convey itself into horrific tragedy. And I point to the example of Emmett Till, who was 14 years old and was viciously murdered by a brutal bunch of, racists, having been accused of wolf whistling at a white woman who, in the just last decade before she passed, admitted that she made that shit right up. That's, I mean, if you've seen pictures of what they did to Emmett Till, that's not a state sanctioned act. But at the time, none of those people were arrested. So, if not state sanctioned, certainly not state condemned at that time, right? There was not the horror and outrage amongst the white community, either North or South, that really propelled forward at that time any significant change. Emmett Till was not really brought to bear until, decades later in the civil rights movement, when people kind of were looking back to that and going that, like, that is just one, like, and it's a dramatic example, which is why people continuously bring it up, because it's so beautifully, not beautifully, horrifically, but when I say beautifully, I mean succinctly and profoundly encapsulates just exactly how much of a problem, a community awareness of a given, quote unquote truth translates into direct action that affects people's lives. And in some cases, ends those lives, which is serious business. So, again, inalienable rights, but mitigated by free will. You then, kind of move into a territory of the understanding of like a moral right versus a legal right, right? You might make the distinction between like murder and voting. That's a good, kind of counterpoint. Like, murder is a moral, you have the right to not be murdered. Like, again, life is the first one on the list, in that list of, our inalienable rights. It's life. So murder is a moral right, or rather, your right not to be murdered, making murder a significant transgression of rights. In other words, rights in a certain social context, it's a kind of moral doctrine formulated through cumulative societal processes and evolving amongst communities over time. Slavery is an excellent example of this. Once again, slavery in our current day understanding is like probably the worst thing that you can imagine, right? Being held prisoner, captive, forced servitude, being separated from your families, being, beaten and tortured with impunity, being you get it. Slavery's fucking horrible. It's horrible. But slavery was as mentioned before, a historical institution that existed throughout history and is not unique to Americans and wasn't unique to Americans at the time of our Declaration of Independence in the late 18th century. But America, as we do with many things, we took that problem and we made it our own. We made it bigger, we made it stronger, we made it stupider. And it has continued to haunt us and continues to haunt us because we sort of right now refuse to face it. We refuse to look it in the face and deal with that. But I'll talk more about that in another episode, more in depth. So there we have it. Rights, inalienable. They're on board rights. So if they're innate rights, then where do they come from? I'd say that most people on the planet are religious in some sense. They believe in God in some sense. And so I think for a lot of people, it's not problematic to the extent that rights are endowed by God. They're endowed by your creator. That's what it says in the Declaration of Independence. But what if you don't believe in God? Or rather, stated more objectively, what if, there is no God? What if there's no sentient creator, right? Like, or what if your idea of God is different, like in Buddhism or Confucianism or Taoism? What if your idea of God isn't, the idea of a single sentient, deity or even multiple deities, right? Like, where does it come from? What is it? And in some ways, does it matter, right? Like, I think that, for me, the answer to that question is it doesn't matter, right? Like, my rights exist by virtue of my existence on the planet, but I don't think I'm really in a popular opinion group there. I kind of feel that way about, you know, animals to a certain, like living creatures in general. Like they have some rights too, but I'm bigger and I need to eat. And, I don't want mice in my house. So, my rules. I don't know. That could be perceived as wrong. I'm sure if there are animal rights activists out there who feel differently, I might hear from them. And if so, I welcome that conversation. I'd be delighted to talk about it and hear your thoughts. But that's not the central issue here. It merely is intended to point out that once again, the idea of rights, it can't be, kind of grounded upon the assumptions of some third party who has sort of defined it, right? We got to define it for ourselves. And it is defined more or less by how we live and exist amongst one another in a given point in time. The question of individual rights really, for me, seems only to be properly contextualized within a framework of the infringement of those rights by another or the assertion of those rights over another. And so I think in a more simplistic way, the idea of rights really can only be understood within a framework of power. Moreover, there's the problem of individual consciousness and our individual, sort of epistemological understanding of the world. This is in my mind a pretty detailed idea that I may break down more fully later, but for the moment, suffice to say, I have this belief that our experiences of the world are almost impossible to articulate outside of our own heads, that our objective realities are not objective. They are defined very carefully by the processes of stimulus input into our physiological meat puppets and how our brains then take those inputs and put them all together, influenced by the way our cognitive processes evolve throughout our development, influenced by trauma, influenced by our, the information sphere in which we cultivated these notions, right? It's all very nuanced. And to my way of thinking, since there's really, no way of objectively arbiting a conflict of rights because of that lack of, real shared experience in the world, it seems necessary to me to carefully review the framework that the rights in question sit within. I think it's appropriate to ask some questions about that framework in general, like what is its origin, right? Who is its author? Who does it benefit? Who does it harm? I think we are inundated in our lives with all this information that some of which is survival based and some of which is those other areas of basic needs, emotional gratitude and safety and security. And, all of those things take up a lot of our focus and attention. And so it's the act of empathy and the act of, trying to understand another person's lived experiences is an active act of compassion and can be a difficult journey for a lot of people, particularly if there feels like there's a threat, like it feels some kind of like an existential threat to you to acknowledge some basic truths, which is I think a potential factor for a lot of people, whether they, knowingly deal with that or not. I think looking at that framework again by extension, it's reasonable to look at rights as an indicator of and an agent of structures of power. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in my next part of this episode. So, with that, I'm going to leave it there. And thank you very much for listening in. I appreciate it. I hope that there's some ideas here that inspire you or, give you an opportunity to think a little bit differently about how we process the idea of rights and how that can be part of our everyday lives, whether, where our rights are being infringed upon or not, right? It's important to sort of stay on top of those things in an active and very divisive culture, such as the American culture at this moment in time. So, yeah, I hope that you'll join me again. And I hope to see you next time in part 2, where I talk about power. See ya. Until next time. Pop, 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 pop.